BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Just dropping a couple quick announcements first. I would like to say that we have compiled our uploads on Hal Snook in his relation to the Zodiac Killer mystery into a playlist, and that will be available in the description box here. It's a 4-part playlist that includes our most recent set of uploads, as well as the one we did on the psychological profile of Hal Snook. That one is coming first, and we talk about his personality, his connections to the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. We have one on Hal Snook as a possible Zodiac Killer suspect, and then just the general discussion and follow-up notes. Once again, the 4-part playlist on Hal Snook is available in the description box. If you haven't heard that one yet, highly recommend it. And tomorrow, if you're listening to these things live as they come out, we'll be doing something on the connections to the Zodiac Killer and astrology, the calendar, months of the year, and the chronology of the whole thing. So look out for that one. And if you're listening to this in the future, we will have an upload on that one. Okay, now on to today's topic. Multiple people requested to hear something about Don Harden as a Zodiac Killer suspect. And first and foremost, I would say that, excuse me for taking a while to get this one out. We did that series on Hal Snook, and I thought it was just going to be one upload. Then I realized we're going to be doing 2 uploads. Then I realized it turned into 3 uploads, and it took a while because with the Don Harden theory, there's a channel called Zodiac Killer Identified that talks all about Donald Gene Harden as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and I wanted to get through all of the videos that were posted there so we could talk about Don Harden as a Zodiac Killer suspect. And, you know, it takes a while to watch all of them, even though some of them are rather short. However, the guy that runs that channel, I believe his name is Zep. Big thank you to him as well. Let's just talk about some of the claims that are made in regards to Don Harden as a Zodiac Killer suspect. First, I thought we could lay out the case for, and then halfway through, we will talk about the case against. The first thing we should say is, Don Harden is most famous to the Zodiac world as being the person who was involved with solving the 408 Cipher. I like killing people because it is so much fun. Slaves in paradise. The 408 Cipher. It was cracked by a school teacher and his wife. Well, that was Don Harden. And that's another thing we should be very clear about. It was Harden and his wife, but he cracked the 408 Cipher. And this is somewhat of a narrative that it's somewhat of a repeating narrative, I should say, because when we talked about Gareth Penn as a suspect, it is what I said was the best narrative. You got this guy who comes out as a researcher, and then he says, hey, I think I figured out some of the secrets in the Zodiac Killer mystery, and then he becomes a suspect in the whole thing. Gareth Penn, of course, went on to become a suspect himself. Even Robert Graysmith went on to become a suspect, not as the Zodiac Killer, no, but as an active participant in the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. So what do we say about Don Harden? Number one, some of the points that would support Don Harden having a greater role in the Zodiac Killer mystery is that he was the person who figured out how to solve the 408 Cipher. He can say that same thing. Hey, look. Here's how it's done. The zodiac symbol, the circle with the cross going through it, could have come from a variety of things that were in Don Harden's life. Most particularly, he owned 2 different Fords, a Ford Fairlane and a Ford Galaxy. Now, the Ford Fairlane has a hood ornament, and I'm citing Zodiac Killer Identified for all of this, where there's a very similar design circle with a cross going through it. The tail lights on the Fords had a rounded image with 4 points off to the sides. That's something that stands out, but there's even something bigger there. With Don Harden, he was a member of the Unitarian Church, and he was even president of his Unitarian Church and for a time, and I just really have to give credit to Zodiac Killer Identified for pulling up so many news articles about Don Harden, and you could see that he has things in the paper about the Unitarian Church. If you were to go into Google Images right now and pull up the cross that the Unitarians use. You might see a circle with a smaller cross, like off to the side, but there's a Unitarian cross that is a circle with a cross going through it. I even mentioned that when I was living in Maryland, I came to West Virginia in 1995, but in Maryland, when I was growing up, the first church that I remember was one with a circle and a cross going through it on the top. And it was most likely that we just lived close by to a Unitarian church. That's the one that we're always passing when we're going out in the car. It's very normal to see that symbol. So you can see that the symbology is already taking shape. Someone already has this definitive connection. And another thing that was shared by Zepp is that there was also a Mount Diablo Unitarian church. And that could also be one of the clues in regards to that particular Zodiac letter. Now, I would say, if you've listened this far, there is a big thing that I want to share with you right now. A lot of people talk about their possibilities of a Zodiac Killer having occult connections. The people talk about witchcraft, magic and sorcery. Did this person genuinely believe he was collecting slaves in the afterlife? Well, what I would say is, more so than that, what we can say about the Zodiac Killer is that there are definitive connections to literature. There are definitive connections to a wide variety of sources. This guy, and whoever is involved in the Zodiac Killer mystery, was not pulling ideas out of thin air. These things did not come from the far-off corners of imagination. And also, these things are not from a single source. And one of the big contributions from Zodiac Killer Identified, and I had never heard this one before, but there was a magazine that was put out called Detective Story Magazine. And there was an issue that was written by an individual named Edwin Baird, B-A-I-R-D, Edwin Baird. And it's about Z. And there's even a line in there that says, "This is Z speaking." Now, Zodiac Killer Identified showed the covers for 2 different issues of Detective Story Magazine. And we're going to say something very big about that in a second. But what does this have to do with Don Harden as a Zodiac Killer suspect? After cracking the 408 cipher, Don Harden was interviewed by many different media outlets. And they asked him, what kind of person do you think the Zodiac Killer was? And what he said was that it seems as if the Zodiac was a person who was very intelligent, but maybe was getting his material from a lesser-known detective story. I'm paraphrasing some of that, but detective story was something that he definitely said. That's from the quotation. And there's this thing called Detective Story Magazine that talks about Z. This is the Z speaking, once again written by Edwin Baird. And you can read up on that one, but it actually seems as this guy, Edwin Baird, was working on that stuff. But he left the magazine in 1924, either that or it went under, something to that effect. And that was the first thing I noticed when I saw the covers of the 2 issues where Zepp is citing these sources. One of them was from 1918. And the other was from 1921. And I was like, now, wait a second. We got the Zodiac Killer crimes occurring in 1968, in 1969. I mean, that's quite a substantial amount of time to pull back something from the 1920s and 1918. But then I remembered, and some of the younger listeners are maybe not going to comprehend the magnitude of this, but growing up, we had loads of old magazines keep laying around. And into the new millennium, when we had to move house, we had to throw away all of our old National Geographics, all of our old Scientific Americans. It was very normal to save old magazines because, no internet, no smartphones, no streaming services. People use these things all the time. I grew up in the 90s and we even did this. We would save all the old publications. So it's very possible that Don Harden would have had access to something like this, published in 1918. Detective Story Magazine, 1921 Detective Story Magazine, the story of Z. This can be partnered with something else we've talked about, the Wheel of Death that comes from the Tim Holt comics, as well as Perhaps the film Bloodlust from 1961, The Most Dangerous Game, or The Mikado even. The Zodiac is pulling from many different pieces of literature. And it's the first time that I had heard these things about Detective Story magazine. But, that's something very valuable. If that is not a definitive origin of the Zodiac Killer, it is an enormous coincidence. But, because he said that line, maybe he got it from a lesser-known detective story. It's almost as if it is a hidden connection. Some other things that I heard. On America's Most Wanted, Don Harden was being interviewed. I mentioned frequently that I learned about the Zodiac Killer from America's Most Wanted. And what did he say? I fooled you. He just kind of mutters in, I fooled you at one point. Something that sounds like that. And he just mutters it in. You can hear that on YouTube for yourself there. Also, one of the claims that is made on Zodiac Killer Identified is that Don Harden was definitively disguising his handwriting. And very specifically, he would use certain techniques, like he would take two L's and turn them into an uppercase E and then put a line on top. It's a little bit difficult to talk about that on a podcast, so we should just say that there are explanations provided about why and how Don Harden would be able to make his handwriting look like the Zodiac Killer's handwriting. But I hope that, if anything, we have stood firm on the claim that the Zodiac Killer would have been drawing from many different pieces of literature and had exposure to things in regards to influences that would have created the Zodiac Killer persona. In addition to that, there's also a newspaper article that features an individual named Charles Lackey, who was teaching at the Unitarian Church where Gene Harden was the president for a time. And what he was teaching about was Egyptian symbology, like the foundations of hieroglyphics and the connections to all of those things. What was it called? Glyphology, I believe, was the word that they used. So Don Harden could have had all kinds of access to learn about symbols and patterns. That's something that would have provided an explanation for the ciphers. Bear in mind, once again, they say that Don Harden and his wife cracked the cipher, and they were the ones that solved it. All right. Now, I said that we were going to play some counterbalance and look at the possibility, let's say challenging the claims about Don Harden as the Zodiac Killer. Number one, it's a repetitive narrative. We said it happened to Gareth Penn. It happened to Robert Graysmith. Oh, you revealed something about the Zodiac Killer? Now you are a suspect yourself. Okay? So how many people are going to be making these claims about anybody who learns something about the case is automatically becoming a suspect? The second thing to say is, when I was talking to Drew Beeson, we interviewed him about his book, Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, and after the interview, we talked for a little bit, and one of the things that he shared with me is that Don Harden and his wife had a daughter, and she says she remembers very clearly her parents were working on that cipher together. They were trying to solve the cipher. Is he just duping them the whole time? Is he just messing around the whole time? Is he just leading it on, or is the wife in on this? Is the daughter in on this? It's like you have to make a certain set of assumptions. But he says very clearly, the Zodiac seemed like some guy who was so full of himself, the first letter in the 408 cipher was probably I. And then after you had I, you could put I next to two letters, and that would give you the double L for I and kill. Then they found that kill became killing, and then they could see L-I-K. That gives you the word like. I like killing. And then they were able to solve the cipher from there on. While that is a simple substitution cipher, the FBI looked at it, they couldn't get anywhere, and, it was Don Harden and his wife who had the insight to look at the letter I and think that that was the first thing going on. At the same time, that is not definitive evidence. So what? His taillights looked like something that is not even quite the Zodiac symbol? That's not very substantial. And furthermore, we should say that it's just becoming a little bit too superficial, and circumstantial is one word that people use when they're talking about a lot of these Zodiac Killer suspects. And I would definitely say that you get some creepy feelings when you're looking into all these things about Don Harden, especially that thing about the Detective Story magazine. But where is the precise information with that? Where is something like fingerprints? Where is something like, DNA or the side palm print testing on the letters? I mean, we would need something so much more than just these coincidences. And in short, that's what a lot of these things are. They are examining the coincidences, and there are a lot of claims that are made about Don Harden and his handwriting and how certain dots were left at certain letters. You can see this on the channel Zodiac Killer Identified. What I honestly believe is, prior to computers, what did people do? They wrote on pads, or a writing pad, and a lot of those dots could probably just be that the pen is going through the pad and leaving a little bit of ink, like a writing pad. And then the last thing to say about that is, as far as the Zodiac Killer leaving any signals with dots or anything, sometimes people write letters and the pen just accidentally touches the paper in weird ways. I had that habit back in middle school, and for some reason, middle schoolers seem to want to make fun of every possible angle. But, if they can make fun of you for something, they will. But yeah, when my pen would touch the paper, sometimes a dot would turn into two dots, and people do this all the time when they are writing, and it might not be significant of anything. And the first and foremost thing I would say is Don Harden's handwriting doesn't resemble the Zodiac Killer's handwriting. You have to go through a whole steps of process. Oh, he would have disguised his handwriting this way. He would have had to have done it that way. That is making an assumption. And the second thing to say is, he said the words detective story. Well, big deal. Did he say the guy was reading Detective Story magazine and it must have come from this thing? I would stand by the claim that I think that is something very valuable as the origin of the Zodiac Killer, or just that you're dealing with somebody who is pulling from many different sources of literature and trying to put it all together. Could Don Harden have done that? Yes, but could other suspects have done that as well? Absolutely. That isn't very precise and so on. So what I would say is that I think that it's a very compelling narrative, but we see this narrative happening time and time again about how just because someone is learning something about the case, or they revealed, hey, here's how something could have possibly been created, then they would have to also be involved with the Zodiac Killer mystery. And I don't know about that. I think that we would need something much more substantial. So I would just like to say in closing that Don Harden, when he's wearing a pair of glasses, he does heavily resemble the composite sketch. I know we're supposed to talk about the things against, but that definitely does seem like something that's going on right there. But another thing that we always have to remember is countless people resemble the composite sketch. You have a Caucasian male with very short hair and a pair of glasses. Yes, the Zodiac seems to have the widow's peak and all, but Caucasian male with short hair and a pair of glasses. You look at a photo of Paul Stein from prior to 1969, the old photos of Paul Stein, not close to his death, but even he resembles the composite sketch, which shows that was just a very common fashion trend for men. That was just a very common style for men at the time. So when we look at the case of Don Harden, it's I think that there are a lot of good ideas in this one, and there are many videos that you can see about this one here on YouTube. I think there are a lot of good ideas, and especially when you learn that he could have learned about Egyptian glyphology and that could have been the foundation for the Zodiac ciphers. Yes, however, that is simply not enough. Insufficient evidence to lay out the case that Don Harden had anything to do with this, other than being somebody who just figured out how to solve the 408 cipher. So the last thing that I would say is that I think that we should really look at the references in literature, first and foremost, just to find out where they are coming from. I mean, I learn things all the time from YouTube, as we mentioned about Tim Holt and The Wheel of Death. Something like the opera The Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan, that one is talked about much more widely. And, I mean, The Most Dangerous Game as well is all about, I mean, that's what the 408 Cipher is really talking about. A lot of people believe those are references to The Most Dangerous Game. Either that or the film Bloodlust from 1961, which was shown in the, all over California. That was it's a parody of The Most Dangerous Game. So we can first find the pieces of literature that became the foundation for the Zodiac Killer and then trace it back to a single person or group of people. Well, that's all for me. Now, if you have anything to say at all about Don Harden as a Zodiac Killer suspect, I want to hear from you. Please drop something in the comments section below. And until next time.